Great. So, good afternoon, good evening, I guess good morning to others who may be joining us online from other time zones. My name is Manal Stilgaitis, and I work for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I'm an education officer, and I work primarily on higher education, but we are not here to talk only about higher education today. I just wanted to mention that my colleague Rebecca and I were speaking earlier trying to decide how to prioritize which issues we wanted to talk about and which topics we wanted to discuss. And I just wanted to recognize that I think that Father Tom sort of popped the lid off of every single topic. And so I would say that the floor is open, and there is indeed lots and lots to talk about, as I think we already saw from some of the interactions and comments and reflections. The next thing is I want to give a special thanks to Tony, even though I know he just left the room, for inviting us to be a part of this event. So we had first connected with Tony a couple of years ago before COVID, and earlier this year, Tony picked up the phone and called us and said, "We're planning this event, would you like to be a part?" Colleagues and I discussed and said, absolutely, we'd love to come on board, and we had no idea that it was going to evolve into this incredible, very, very high potential event that it has. So we're pleased to be here. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the support that RMEN has given us as we began putting the pieces together for a delegation of refugee students and young leaders to join us here today. So they all arrived yesterday. Some coming from as far as Zimbabwe, but also Morocco, Uganda, etc., and then some closer to home. They come from home countries, including Afghanistan, Syria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq, Burundi, and elsewhere. I would like to take a moment and just ask you, colleagues, if you would stand, please. Just so that you all know, sorry, not everybody. This is our group here. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we are in a room together, that there are refugees and refugee students and refugee leaders here with us. So I would encourage you, as always, that we're talking together, not about or in absentia. And please reach out to them. Look at their faces, recognize who they are, and reach out to them. They're the ones with the expert experience. They're the ones with the first-hand knowledge. So I invite you to make that connection. Thanks, guys. There's a session tomorrow about the potential for networks, such as the Refugee Migrant Education Network, to influence and really change the refugee education space. And so part of the reason that we're here and that we brought all these incredible young people and brought ourselves is because we see the partnership with all of you as a network as incredibly high potential. And I hope this is the beginning, as Tony said at the beginning, of a web of partnerships that we don't know where they're going to go today. We have no idea if we shake hands, if we're going to end up being able to do something incredible together. But I have no doubt that we will see some of this take root and create incredible things over the next and coming years. With that, I'm going to turn to our panel. And there's Sarah online. I'll just say these are some of the best minds on refugee education in the world. And I'm not just saying that because Becky's my boss, but really, truly, since I met Roberta, since I've known the work of JRS, Sarah has worked with UNHCR for many years. These are some of the real innovative, really well-experienced minds on refugee education. So after we've had some interventions, I encourage you to ask the questions, right? Take advantage of being able to, as Father Tom did, pop the top off of these questions and really get into the issues. So if I can introduce, first, Roberto Malibasset is Global Lead for Tertiary Education at the World Bank. She recently co-authored what I call a game-changing report titled Steering Tertiary Education Towards Resilient Systems That Deliver for All. On screen is Sarah Dryden-Peterson. Sarah is Associate Professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's the founder and director of REACH, which promotes research, education, and action for refugees, and has been involved in many other areas of refugee education over the years. Rebecca Telford, on the far end, is Chief of Education for UNHCR. Prior to joining UNHCR, she held several positions, including working for UNICEF, and most recently served as Education Advisor with the United Kingdom's Department for International Development in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then finally, Father David, who has kindly stepped in. And I can say a few words about him, but I would imagine that most of you know him better than I do. So I think Father David has worked in many parts of the world in deep field locations, including much of it in Southern Africa, if I'm not mistaken. So he's an expert on professional and post-secondary education. Is that good enough? Great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. With that, we're going to jump into the first round of questions. And again, we want to consider this a really interactive environment. So, we'll go ahead and make interventions, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments in the end. So I'm going to start. Sarah, if it's okay with you, I'm going to start with you. Great. Sarah, through your research, you've looked extensively at the role that education plays in building peaceful and participatory societies. How do you view the current state of education in the world and what education means for situations of fragility and conflict? And I apologize, I should have introduced that the title of this session is Refugee Education in Times of Peril. And so I think we can either take that for granted and say it is in a time of peril, or we can sort of challenge that and present alternative views. But Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Manal. I hope you can all hear me. Just, of course, stop me if you can't. I wanted to jump into this question really following up on one of the questions that was asked in the last session, this idea of what education actually looks like, and to focus in on a few ideas about what and how children learn as shaped by 3 Ps. I'd like to talk briefly about power, purposes, and pedagogies. And also, as I think that we've been inspired to think both in terms of what is now and what can be, this kind of aspiration. So power, access to education and learning in theory enable opportunity. But I think what we see globally is that these kinds of opportunities that we imagine might be open to refugee young people, that refugee families imagine might be open to them by pursuing an education, are often closed by their status as non-citizens, by discrimination, by xenophobia. And this needs to be core to how we think about what and how children learn. Second, and related, is connected to this idea of purposes, that refugee families almost always describe the purposes of education as being about the future, this type of hope that we just heard about. But the inclusion models of education where refugees have access to national systems are the structures of schooling and the content of schooling that are really designed for national students. They don't involve this kind of inclusive approach generally. Instead, learning about and for the host country, even if the opportunities that education promises are out of reach for refugee children. The third P of pedagogy is really about what happens in classrooms, what children experience. And I think what we see is this persistent dilemma of relational integration, of really thinking about experience in schools towards this notion of the shared we that we heard about in the opening. But instead, what we see is what closely mirrors the experiences of other marginalized children globally, including alienation from curriculum, exclusion and discrimination in relationships with teachers and peers. So I think as we think about what can be, which I see as such a central question driving all of these conversations, what we find does work, as the question was posed in the last session, needs to address these 3 Ps of power, of purposes, and of pedagogies really head on in terms of what and how children learn. One idea that we have found in terms of purposes, power, and pedagogies and how they can come together in classrooms where refugees learn is through teachers' use of what we call socio-political protection, We observe teachers often in refugee settings to really be extending the more common paradigm of legal and rights-based protection that generally focuses on physical safety to focus more on social relations in the classroom. In particular, the ways that teachers respond to truly contextualize social, political, economic harm through dialogue and activities that address specific concerns, questions, ideas that students have, of really moving from this dialogue then towards action. This feels really hard, both for students and for teachers. It can feel risky, it shifts constantly, and because it demands engaging with the perilous nature of these politics and not around them, not skirting them. In one study we did in Lebanon, students described how effective teachers supported them to overcome the fixed structures and content of schooling by really focusing on the disconnects in their experiences, being included in Lebanese national education systems, but excluded from the curriculum they were learning. One student shared about her civics teacher who motivated students, as she said, to become part of society, to have greater importance and not just be on the margins. This was the talk. The teacher reminded them that with civics, they might be able to change other people's perspectives. But this teacher also acknowledged the dissonance between this kind of optimism for students as agents of change and their limited power as refugees and as students. The student recalled how this teacher admitted that, quote, in the end, nothing of what's in this lesson exists. We wish it does. But the teacher went on, both in words that day and in actions with students in the classroom, to encourage them about the future. She said, it's true, you're learning things that don't exist, but you might be the reason they exist in the future. You might do things related to politics, and you can change and do the things that you studied about. I hope that today and this week in these conversations that we really build on experiences of students, of teachers, of leaders who are in this group and in this conversation in terms of really deepening and building it. What we see is that this socio-political protection through classroom relations can support refugee students to critically engage with and make sense of lived realities of displacement, of contextualized forms of harm, these experiences of perilous times in that particular place and that particular time, but also to connect it to an unknowable but deeply aspired for future. And I think this is the key. We see teachers and students working together to think about not only protection and learning now, but also for the future. Protection to think and act in ways that actually transform perilous times rather than just reflect them. I'm so looking forward to this conversation, and thank you for the invitation to join it.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We really appreciate it. We wish you were here with us, of course, but we're so happy that you've been able to join. Just to reflect for those who may not be familiar with humanitarian space or humanitarian work, this idea of education having a protective function is something quite, I would say, jargony, right? That those of us who work in emergency or work in humanitarian space, lots of times we talk extensively about protection. And in some cases, the protection world and the education world don't necessarily know how to communicate with one another. But I think that what Sarah has said is really helpful, and I'm going to turn over to Becky now, who does straddle those worlds. So Becky's an education professional, but she's chief of education at UNHCR, which also makes her, a professional in the emergency space. So Becky, as I said, you have a view of refugee education at all levels and in all parts of the world. So what does refugee education in perilous times mean to you?
Great, thank you. And this is quite nice. I was expecting to be really controversial, but Father Tom did it all, so now I can just relax into my pleasant talking points. I think it's kind of well known that forced displacement has really severe and disproportionate impacts on children. I think that's not a surprise to people. The UNHCR Global Education Report just came out for this year, and the kind of subheading of that report was, education for refugees, moral imperative, a united endeavour, and a global priority. And I think that's a really important point to come from. Not just because, we collectively know that it matters, but I think it matters now more than ever. And that's not just because of the numbers. I mean, there's, you know, not such a professional after all. You know, there's 100 million displaced people at the moment, as we know. And there's at least 10 million refugees of school age under UNHCR's mandate. And that means in terms of putting in place support, trying to ensure that refugees have access to education which is meaningful, which is protective, but which is also part of a pathway to a future, is kind of our responsibility. But it's something that we definitely and, you know, cannot be doing alone. Education interrupted by displacement can be difficult to restart. And again, I think that's not rocket science, right? I mean, refugee children miss out on an average of 3 to 4 years of school, because once you're displaced, if you miss out on a year, it's much harder to get back in. Very often, when refugees move to somewhere, they're likely to be fewer schools, you know, poorer quality, and have issues with language of instruction, for example. Sarah talked about some of the issues on curriculum and relevance. And there are also issues around, you know, basic safety, safety and certainty, and having family confidence to send their kids to schools when those schools do exist. I think it was mentioned already, but refugee enrollment is lower than for that of non-refugees. And as refugees get older, the picture really does worsen. We just published our most recent statistics. And so 68% of children are now enrolled in primary, which is great. I mean, it's up from 50% about 20 years ago, but it's still not amazing. But that drops to 37% in secondary. And obviously, secondary is where a lot of the protective pathways come through in terms of supporting children to become more economically active, to marry later, to feel like they have more choices in life, and also then to go through to tertiary education. And, you know, we've experienced with Manal trying to find places where actually we might have the ability to give scholarships to children, but they're just not graduating secondary school. And so making sure that we don't forget that whole education pathway, I think, is really critical. So I think we've heard quite a lot about inclusion today. For UNHCR, inclusion really focuses on including refugees into national education systems. And that's for a number of reasons. It really does seem to be the best and the most sustainable way to actually offer a quality education. There's lots of different practices around that. There's lots of different mechanisms, you know, pieces of support and opportunities. But actually getting into the system, having that happen in such a way that they're really kind of welcomed and able to meaningfully engage does actually mean that children can then access, you know, accredited and certified education. I think there are, you know, there's a lot of people trying to do a lot of good things, but I think sometimes we go a bit off-piste, because, you know, refugees very often are unprotected. I was reading a paper about the private sector engagement in the Syrian crisis, and 85% of the money spent by private sector companies on education was on untested edtech solutions, because people felt able to, you know, the kind of something is better than nothing idea. So I think it's important to look at, you know, what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and be open to reflecting on that. The main thing I think is, you know, there are pretty dire straits at the moment. I mean, I think, honestly, sometimes I feel like the whole world is in peril at the moment. I know that's not really the point of this conversation, but, you know, things can feel quite dark. And I think education is something that we can come back to as a kind of source of light, right? A source of bringing people in, making sure that that children are kind of looked after and that they have this vision for a future. I always think it's interesting when you talk to young refugees and their families, because very often people are having to prepare for 3 possible futures, right? What do I need if I'm going to stay here in the host country? What do I need if I'm going to return home? And home might be somewhere that needs rebuilding or needs kind of additional engagement. And what am I going to need if I get resettled or if I move forward? And I think just reflecting on, you know, the incredible amount that young refugees put in and how much they have to kind of strive and prepare for, not just for those multiple futures, but even to kind of access education and then to become, you know, we talk very often about how young refugees, particularly who undergo tertiary education, become role models for their community. And I think that's fabulous, but it's also a massive responsibility, right? And I think reflecting on that should help us to think about the responsibility that we can take so that we're able to put in place what else is needed. there does need to be a huge collective effort. And again, I just want to recognize that there is already an effort in place. I mean, 85% of the world's refugees are hosted in lower and middle income countries. And there are communities, you know, teachers, families are all kind of getting in and doing what they can. And they're people who will, you know, we were talking about this earlier, they're people who will, you know, they'll never be celebrated. Like, no one will really remember the name of the kind of Ugandan primary school teacher who said, do you know what, I can fit 10 more kids in here. Like, I won't even apply for funding. Let's just kind of get you in. Let's make sure that our budget just spreads a little bit further. But those are the people who are doing this every day. And then I think from our perspective, as people kind of working on these issues internationally, remembering what that looks like, and then thinking, what is the part, you know, what is the part that we can do? What does kind of partnering with host country institutions look like? What does coming together in a network like this and making really concrete decisions about things like, you know, certificate equivalency and recognition across Catholic universities? What are the things that we can do in order to just amplify the things that people are already doing in order to try and make a world that works for all of us? Thanks.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks for that segue as well, in terms of talking about inclusion and system strengthening for national education systems. Roberta, your work in the World Bank looks at how higher education, your work specifically, can serve to advance national development. So if you could help us to understand, how does refugee higher education fit into that humanitarian development picture?
Thank you very much. And thank you to the university and to UNHCR for inviting me here, and by extension, the World Bank. The World Bank is, in general, not part of these conversations, or hasn't been historically, and so it's a real privilege for me to be part of this conversation and to extend to you an opportunity to ask questions about the work that we do, and also to share a bit about the work we do. We do have the largest investment body outside of national governments in education in the world. So the World Bank's influence in education is profound, and we take that influence quite seriously. I will speak today explicitly about higher education because that is my area. So just for a little background, the World Bank over the last 7 years or so has been supporting projects equal to about $9 billion in countries all around the world, mostly low and lower middle income countries. And as Becky said, 85% of refugees who are out of country are in low and middle income countries. They are affecting dramatically the countries in which we are doing the vast majority of our work. And so to segue into the question that Manal asked, this is a new area for the World Bank to be considering, and part of that emerged from our support for Roma students in Europe. And so this is a bit of the evolution of our work. We have been working with Roma students, Roma populations, for generations in Europe especially, and noticed that as we were improving their movement through the pipeline, there were pressures on primary education, we were improving their secondary education. What happens? They need a place to go. Something has to happen for students when they finish in any country context after they finish secondary education. This pipeline pressure is what we're seeing globally, especially in lower and lower middle income countries. Primary education is being managed incredibly well. In some parts of the world, we're seeing 99% of students enrolling in primary education. Secondary education in the 80s. What happens at tertiary education is astonishingly bad in most of the regions where we work. Sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 9% across the continent are enrolling in tertiary education. In some of the countries where I work, it's as low as 3 and 4%. Refugee communities are even lower than that in those host countries. And so the pressure on national development is that there are people of talent and capacity who are being excluded from those spaces where they can contribute the most. And this is where we are intervening. Now, what we are doing is actually things like this. We're trying to get to those who are on the ground supporting refugee communities most directly and serving as the conduit between these conversations and the governments where we work. So the World Bank lends to national governments. We don't lend to institutions and we don't lend to individuals. We do all of our lending at the national level to ministries of finance. When we are doing those loans, we bring this type of conversation to the Minister of Finance, to the Minister of Education. I need to have the data and the narratives that can convince a ministry to lend and borrow, for us to lend, for them to borrow, against a certain activity or actions that can bring returns to that country. It's very economic, it's very sort of mathematic, but it also is emotional. We can say to a minister very comfortably, your country cannot develop if you have a mass of people who are not being served and are not being given opportunities for their own advancement, for community advancement. With that, we can then calculate what those contributions could be. And that's sort of the triangulation between this type of a group, UNHCR's work, the World Bank, and the national governments. And so what we're trying to do from here forward is to have refugees be part of this conversation for every education project that we're leaning towards, that we're supporting in all of our client contexts. We do that for gender. We already do it for climate. We really want to include refugees in that dynamic as well. I'll stop here, but I really am open to questions from any of you here about our work or how we support refugee education.
Fantastic. Thanks, Roberta. And just to give you a heads up, if somebody else doesn't ask about the STEER report, I'm going to ask you about some of the highlights or the top 5 or top 3. David, turning to you, I think that you've got quite a different perspective, perhaps, to present. And so my question then would be, can you tell us about the work of JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, and what is at stake in providing education in the most hard-to-reach areas, most underserved areas amongst the 57 or so countries where JRS is working? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. So just a disclaimer, I heard that I might be standing in for Tom this afternoon, sometime this morning, and I got this question literally about 3 minutes before the start of the session. So forgive me for a bit of unpreparedness. The JRS education work is, it reaches around about 325,000 odd people each year, and the livelihoods, an additional 108, even though 108,000, we sort of put them together. I think we come off a classic NGO or INGO thing where we ran schools. And as my colleagues on both sides of me have said, that model is now superseded. We didn't reach all of the people that we'd like to, that we needed to reach, and we need different models, and particularly the model of national governments. So our question is, how do we assist national governments, and how do we reach people that fall through the cracks? We had quite a consultation with different refugee communities and also host communities or affected communities, and I don't want to characterise these communities as homogeneous. As we know, it's multiple communities in what we call community, and they helped us prioritise a number of different areas, which we've since begun sort of working in. The need for young women, particularly in Africa, to be better educated and to be included, to continue with secondary education in particular. Access for people with disability. The link between education and refugee futures work, and particularly for those who do not get, who have the interrupted education and don't get through through secondary education. What happens to those people? The need for teachers who are adapting, as Sarah referred to, adapting to the needs of the young people that they're presented with. People who might go home to a vicarious trauma situation, who might lack the language skills. And then with the aspects of reconciliation in communities that often come to the fore at parent-teachers' nights or at the sort of parent-teacher organisation that's running the school in many of these areas. So if we saw as our contribution, we're not able to sort of do the big picture, fill in all the gaps of refugee education around the world. But if we focused on some of these areas, then we perhaps could do some good and could complement the fantastic work that World Bank and many of you people and UNHCR are doing. I think a really good example of it was of what can happen. I was in South Africa for a long time working with refugees, and I really felt that if refugees didn't have work, which was often the case, refugees do have work rights in South Africa generally, but if they couldn't get work for whatever reason, their suite of human rights didn't exist, practically speaking. They couldn't send their kids to school. They couldn't access the documents. They couldn't do this. They couldn't do that. They couldn't access transport. So I am really interested in that nexus between education, preparing people for the rest of their lives. And so they need skills for that. But not just skills, they need sort of life skills and things that will equip them to be able to survive with or without work in their communities. The skills to negotiate the reconciliatory needs in their communities, etc., etc. I have examples, very good examples of working with universities, working with other NGOs, working with tech. I think there's a particular opportunity with tech that's for people working in refugee camps, refugee camps and refugee areas, urban areas, to work in the technical sort of, or the tech industry, if you like. I think just a couple of things I'd like to say. We're very aware of the protective function, and I really appreciated Sarah's comments that it's more than just a unidimensional thing. I've talked to the futures function and the purpose, and then I think, can we think education for all of us means 0 to 12, roughly speaking, then what, associates, bachelor's, master's, doctorate, you know, that kind of trajectory. Can we take a step out of that? I know that Amanda's here from Luminous that provides vocational, but can we think in terms of microcredits, nanocredits, people who have responsibilities, have young children, like in Kenya, where they're in households of up to 12 people, they've got 3 dependents. How can we provide an education for that, for those people, that's realistic to their needs, that's not going to be utopian, but that will help them put food on the table? I think I'll just leave you with those questions. Thank you.